It sat in a freezer drawer at a university lab, catalogued, sealed, unremarkable to look at. A small mass of dried organic matter, dark brown, roughly the size of a fist. Nothing about its appearance suggested it mattered. Radiocarbon dating said otherwise. The number that came back from the lab was wrong for where it had been found. Not wrong by decades, not wrong by centuries, wrong by over 1,000 years, measured against everything the continent's origin story was supposed to allow. The people who dated it ran the test again. Same result. This is the story of an object that shouldn't have existed where it was found, and what it forced an entire field to admit it didn't know. For most of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans was told with confidence, and the confidence was earned. Sometime around 13,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer groups crossed a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, following herds of mammoth and bison through a corridor that opened as glaciers retreated. They moved south. They spread across the continent with remarkable speed, leaving behind a signature so distinctive that archaeologists could identify it at a glance. A fluted, leaf-shaped spear point, first found near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. Wherever this point turned up, it turned up in roughly the same window of time, across thousands of miles, from the Great Plains to the Gulf Coast. That consistency became the backbone of the Clovis first model. One migration, one technology, one founding population, spreading outward like ripples from a single stone dropped in water. It was a clean story. It explained the evidence available at the time, and for decades it held. Textbooks taught it, museums built exhibits around it. Researchers who challenged it were, more often than not, quietly dismissed. One of them was a University of Oregon archaeologist who spent the late 1930s excavating a series of caves in the high desert of south-central Oregon, and who came away convinced he'd found something that predated Clovis entirely. He wasn't taken seriously. He died in 1994, still saying he'd been right. Here is where it gets complicated. Decades after that dismissed excavation, a new team returned to the same caves, a system of 8 wave-cut shelters above a dry lake bed, carved into volcanic rock by waves that hadn't existed for thousands of years. They weren't looking for spear points this time. They were looking at feces, fossilized human waste, coprolites, preserved in the dry cave sediment for millennia. It sounds almost absurd as evidence, but coprolites hold something spear points never can: DNA. Genetic material, locked inside organic waste, waiting. A research team led by University of Oregon archaeologist Dennis Jenkins recovered dozens of these samples, and in 2007, DNA analysis confirmed something extraordinary. The material was human, and when it was radiocarbon dated, the results placed it at roughly 14,300 years old, as much as 1,200 years before the accepted Clovis arrival window. Eske Willerslev, a geneticist at the University of Copenhagen's Center for Ancient Genetics, who worked on the material, called it the oldest human DNA yet obtained anywhere in the Americas. The mitochondrial DNA, think of it as a genetic thread passed down almost unchanged through the maternal line, a surname written into the body instead of on paper, pointed to ancestry from Siberia or East Asia. That part fit the existing picture. The date did not. Clean signal, wrong century. Researchers were careful to frame this as probability, not certainty at first. A single site, however compelling, is not proof of an entire revised timeline. But the caves kept producing evidence, and it kept pointing the same direction. Eventually, more than 190 radiocarbon dates were generated from material recovered at the site: coprolites, bone, sagebrush twigs pulled from carefully mapped sediment layers. And in 2012, researchers published something that made the anomaly harder to dismiss: stone tools known as Western stemmed points, a distinct technology from Clovis, dated to at least 13,200 years old. Not a rumor, not a disputed fringe claim, a dated, published, peer-reviewed artifact tradition, existing at the same time as Clovis, possibly earlier, and looking nothing like it. This is the part the records don't explain cleanly. If Clovis technology spread outward from a single migration, why does a completely different tradition appear at the same time, in the same hemisphere, seemingly with no shared point of origin? The first theory researchers reach for is the least disruptive one. Multiple migration waves, arriving close together, bringing distinct tool-making traditions that developed in parallel rather than one replacing the other. It doesn't destroy the land bridge model, it complicates it. Instead of one clean wave, you get two overlapping currents, arriving within a similar window, diverging almost immediately once they landed. This theory has real weight behind it. Genetic studies broadly support ancestral ties to Siberian populations for both traditions. But it has a limitation researchers rarely resolve out loud. If both traditions trace back to a shared source population crossing the same bridge, why do the tools look so fundamentally different, this early, this fast? Not by years, by centuries of apparent divergence that the timeline barely allows for. The second theory is more complicated and more contested. It proposes that people didn't come primarily through an interior corridor at all. They came by water, moving down the Pacific coastline in small boats, following a corridor of kelp forests and marine resources, sometimes called the coastal migration route. This route would have been open earlier than the interior corridor, which climate models suggest wasn't fully passable until somewhere around 13,000 to 12,600 years ago, after the Oregon coprolites were already deposited. If people were living inland in Oregon before the interior route existed, a coastal path stops being speculative and starts looking necessary. The trouble is evidence. The coastline these travelers would have followed sits today underwater, buried beneath water that rose as glaciers melted. The theory isn't short on logic. It's starved of proof, not because the idea is weak, but because the ocean swallowed the ground it would have left behind. The third theory is the one most researchers are hesitant to say directly, though the data hasn't ruled it out. It isn't that one migration happened earlier than believed. It's that there may never have been a single founding migration at all. That the peopling of the Americas was a longer, messier, overlapping process, multiple populations trickling in across a window wider than any textbook diagram currently shows. This isn't universally accepted, and it shouldn't be presented as if it were. Even the human origin of the Paisley material has been formally challenged. Researchers from other institutions raised the possibility that DNA had migrated downward through the sediment layers over thousands of years, contaminating older material with younger genetic signal. That challenge led to a follow-up study years later, examining lipid residues, fatty compounds, far less mobile in soil than DNA, extracted from more than 20 of the original coprolites. The results reaffirmed human origin for a portion of the samples. Reinforced, not resolved. The data doesn't confirm the deepest version of this theory. It only fails to rule it out. Imagine standing inside one of those caves 14,000 years ago. The air is thin and cold. You're at over 4,000 feet in a high desert basin where a shallow lake once lapped against the rock behind you, carving these shelters out of soft volcanic stone before receding into the flat, dry basin it is today. A hearth burns low near the cave mouth, throwing off the smell of sagebrush smoke. Somewhere nearby, the bones of waterfowl and fish sit discarded from a recent meal, and further out, the remains of animals that don't exist anymore, camels, horses, species that vanished from this continent entirely. You don't know your presence here will matter. You have no reason to think it will. You leave behind a fire, a handful of tools, and eventually, waste, the least intentional record a person can leave. You have no way of knowing that this, out of everything, is what will survive. Not your face, not your name, this. Here is the twist the whole story turns on. Of every kind of evidence recovered from that cave, stone tools shaped with obvious skill, cordage woven from plant fiber, a sandal that survived thousands of years in dry desert air, it was the waste, the thing with the least intentional craftsmanship behind it, that became the most scientifically decisive artifact in the entire debate. Not because it was rare, because it carried DNA, and DNA carries a date that stone tools alone cannot always provide with the same certainty. The substance no one wanted to study ended up outweighing the evidence everyone was originally looking for. And there's an irony underneath that one. The archaeologist who first excavated these caves in the 1930s, who died in 1994, still insisting he'd found evidence of people before Clovis, was not vindicated by a better spear point or a more persuasive argument. He was vindicated by a piece of genetic technology that didn't exist yet when he made his claim, technology that arrived decades after he was gone, and confirmed in its own quiet forensic way that he had been right the entire time. Cressman never learned any of it. The confirmation came for an argument, not for the man who made it. What this really unsettles isn't just the timeline for one region of Oregon. It's the deeper assumption underneath almost every origin story. The idea that a people's beginning is a single, clean event. One crossing, one moment, one arrow drawn confidently on a map. The evidence from these caves suggests something closer to a layered accumulation. Overlapping waves, contested boundaries, populations whose full relationship to one another may never be fully mapped, because so much of the physical evidence that could resolve it now sits underwater or was never preserved at all. That tension isn't unique to this one site. It echoes in migration debates across the world, wherever ancient DNA is starting to outpace the stories built to explain it before that DNA could be read. Somewhere in a Copenhagen laboratory, a geneticist once looked at results from a fistful of ancient waste and said, quietly, that it was the oldest human trace found anywhere in the hemisphere. He wasn't being dramatic, he was stating a measurement. That's usually how these things begin, not with revelation, but with a number that refuses to match the model built to contain it. The caves are still there, carved into that dry basin, still holding sediment layers that haven't all been excavated. This archaeological discovery in Oregon could still change human origins, not because the mystery has been solved, but because the ground itself is still being read. One layer, one date, one impossible number at a time.